On May 4th, 2026, Brent crude jumped 6% in a single trading session to $114.44 a barrel. That is more than 50% above where the price stood on February 28th, the day the United States and Israel went to war with Iran. The trigger that morning wasn't a refinery fire or an OPEC announcement. It was a missile and drone attack on the United Arab Emirates. For decades, the global energy system has run on a single, quiet assumption that no matter what came out of the Persian Gulf, the oil would keep flowing. By the middle of May 2026, that assumption was gone. To understand why one attack on a coastline most of us can't find on a map can move the entire global economy, you have to understand a 21-mile stretch of water that almost nobody outside the shipping industry ever talks about. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open ocean. It sits between Iran to the north and Oman's Musandam Peninsula to the south. At its tightest point, the strait narrows to just 21 miles across. That's the geography. The reason you've heard of it is the traffic. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products moved through it every day. That is about 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed on the planet and roughly a quarter of all the oil that moves by sea. About a fifth of global liquefied natural gas trade, most of it from Qatar, passes through the same lane. In other words, the Strait of Hormuz isn't important because it's a strait. It's important because the world built its entire energy supply chain to depend on it. The strait didn't become a choke point by design, it became one by accident and then by inertia. When commercial oil exports from the Persian Gulf began ramping up in the mid-20th century, the geography was already fixed. The Gulf is essentially an enclosed sea with one exit. Anything loaded onto a tanker in Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura, Iran's Karg Island, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar, or Bahrain has to leave through Hormuz. There is no second door. For decades, this didn't seem like a vulnerability. Through the post-war oil order, the Cold War, and the era of supermajor-led integration, the strait kept flowing. Even during the 1980 to 88 Iran-Iraq War, when more than 450 ships were attacked inside the Gulf, the strait itself was never closed. That history is the reason most analysts have treated Hormuz as a stress test the world has already passed. The 1980s became the template. The strait, the thinking went, was unclosable. To understand why Hormuz is so concentrated, follow the cargo. In 2024, Saudi Arabia alone accounted for about 5.5 million barrels per day moving through the strait, roughly 38% of the crude. The rest comes from Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Iran, and Qatar. Around 84% of that crude was bound for Asian buyers, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea making up the bulk. By contrast, the United States imported only about 0.5 million barrels per day from the Persian Gulf via Hormuz in 2024, roughly 2% of total US oil consumption. That asymmetry matters. Hormuz is not really an American supply problem. It's an Asian supply problem with a global price problem because oil is priced on one curve and a shock anywhere on the curve moves the whole thing. Now, the part most explainers get wrong, the bypass routes. There are 3 real ones. Saudi Arabia's east-west Petroleum pipeline runs across the kingdom to the Red Sea with a nominal capacity of about 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's ADCOP line to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman side can handle around 1.8 million barrels per day. Iran's Ghor-e-Jask pipeline, inaugurated in 2021, is rated at roughly 0.3 million barrels per day, but it has barely been used. Add them up at theoretical maximum and you get about 6.8 million barrels per day of bypass capacity against 20 million barrels per day of normal Hormuz flow, and that's roughly a third on paper. In practice, in early 2026, the EIA's most recent published estimate of effective unused bypass capacity was around 3.5 million barrels per day. That bypass math is no longer hypothetical. In April 2026, Iran struck the Saudi East-West pipeline. The attack damaged one of 11 pumping stations along the conduit and cut throughput by roughly 700,000 barrels per day. Saudi Arabia restored full capacity 3 days later, but the strike still proved that the bypass infrastructure is itself a target, and the next attack may not be so quickly patched. Since the US-Israel war on Iran began on February 28, 2026, traffic through the strait has collapsed by about 95%. In April, only 191 vessels transited Hormuz against roughly 3,000 in a normal month, about 5% of the pre-war pace. As of early May, US military figures put the count at more than 1,550 commercial vessels stranded inside the Gulf, with around 22,500 mariners on board them. Brent crude has moved with it. Prices traded in a $106 to $119 per barrel range through the early phase of the conflict. On May 4th, Brent jumped roughly 6% in a single session to $114.44, about 50% above its 28th of February level. Adam Ereeli, a former US ambassador to Bahrain, has been a notable voice in coverage of the crisis. The International Maritime Organization has described the situation as having no precedent in the modern age. The cold open event isn't a one-off headline, it's a symptom of a system that lost its margin for error. Here is the tension at the heart of the Strait of Hormuz. For 40 years, two stories have run in parallel. The first is the vulnerability story. 20% of world oil through one narrow lane between two regional adversaries in a part of the world that has been at low-grade war for most of living memory. The second is the resilience story. It has all been tested repeatedly, and the strait has always reopened. Both stories were true at the same time. The vulnerability paid the political bills, the foreign policy speeches, the carrier deployments, the alliance commitments. The resilience paid the economic bills, the cheap freight rates, the just-in-time refinery scheduling in Asia, the long-dated oil price assumptions in every macro model. What 2026 is doing is forcing those two stories into a single one. You can no longer hold both. Either the strait is genuinely vulnerable, in which case the global energy system has been priced wrong for decades, or it is genuinely resilient, in which case a 95% collapse in transits is a brief anomaly. The market is starting to pick a side. A Goldman investor survey in early May found a majority of respondents now expect the disruption to persist past the end of June. 43% don't expect a return to normal until after July. The strongest counter-argument to this video's thesis is historical precedent. During the 1984 to 1988 tanker war, the Strait of Hormuz absorbed direct, repeated attacks on commercial shipping, 283 by Iraq, 168 by Iran. 116 merchant sailors were killed, 37 went missing, and 167 were wounded. And yet the strait never closed. Operation Earnest Will, the US-led reflagging and escort operation that began in July 1987, was the largest naval convoy operation since the Second World War. On May 17, 1987, an Iraqi attack on the USS Stark killed 37 American sailors. On August 8, 1988, Iran and Iraq agreed to a ceasefire. Crucially, and this is the load-bearing claim of the opposing view, the real global oil price steadily declined during the 1980s, even as the tanker war raged. Markets, the argument goes, root around choke points. SPR releases OPEC, spare capacity, demand destruction, and substitution all dampen the shock. The 20% of world oil through one straight line is dramatic, but the practical economic effect of disruption has historically been smaller than the headline suggests. This argument deserves to be taken seriously, but three things have changed between 1988 and 2026. First, NATO allies who escorted convoys in the 1980s, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Italy, have declined to participate this time. Second, Iran's posture, by Al Jazeera's reporting, has shifted from a defensive containment doctrine to an explicitly offensive asymmetric posture using missiles, drones, and cyber. And third, only a handful of US minesweepers remain in the Gulf. 4 dedicated minesweepers were decommissioned in the previous year. The 1980s lesson was real. The 2026 conditions don't match it. We've spent the last 40 years treating the Strait of Hormuz like a black swan, something that's technically possible but too catastrophic to actually happen because the world is too connected to allow it. We pointed at the Saudi East-West pipeline or the UAE's Fujairah line as proof that we had a plan B, but the 2026 crisis has stripped that away. Even if those pipes ran at their absolute theoretical maximum, they only handle about a third of what normally flows through the water. And as we saw in April, those pipelines aren't exactly invisible to drones and missiles. If the bypass is just as vulnerable as the strait itself, it isn't actually a bypass. The real danger here isn't just the blockade, it's the fact that our mental model for this crisis was stuck in 1988. Back then, we had a global oil glut and a NATO coalition willing to escort tankers through the chaos. In 2026, that glut is gone. NATO is sitting this one out, and Iran's military isn't just in a defensive crouch. It's an asymmetric, offensive force using missiles and drones that didn't exist 40 years ago. We didn't build a resilient energy system. We built a fragile one on a single point of failure and then used history as an excuse to ignore the risk. The Hormuz problem isn't a temporary military glitch. It's the moment we realize the world's energy architecture has been fundamentally broken for a long time. There are roughly 3 futures from here. None of them are predictions. They are the bands of plausibility implied by the facts we have. Scenario A, negotiated reopening, weeks to months. Operation, Project Freedom or a successor pressure campaign produces a face-saving climb-down. Vessels exit. Brent retraces toward the pre-war range. Some mariners come home. The Saudi East-West pipeline is repaired. The 1980s template wins. Watch for a sustained drop in attacks on bypass infrastructure, a reopening of insurance cover, NATO members re-engaging in escort or minesweeping. Scenario B, long sub-closure, 6 months to a year. Transits stay depressed at a fraction of normal. Goldman's surveyed investors are right that normal doesn't return until after July or later. Asian buyers, China, India, Japan, South Korea, who together took the bulk of Hormuz crude in recent years, accelerate diversification away from the Gulf. OPEC plus spare capacity, the SPR, and demand destruction absorb part of the shock, but $100 plus Brent becomes the new baseline rather than the spike. Watch for persistent transit counts well below the 3,000 vessel monthly norm. Insurance premium structures pricing Hormuz as a permanently elevated risk lane. Scenario C, structural break. The strait does not return to its pre-war role, either through repeated kinetic incidents or through a hardened Iranian posture that the world simply learns to price in. Hormuz becomes a partially used route rather than the default. The bypass capacity is rebuilt with hardening, pipelines reinforced, redundancy added. But capital cycles in energy are decade-long. The architectural change takes 10 years to play out. Watch for multi-quarter declines in tanker bookings via Hormuz, capital announcements for additional non-Hormuz export infrastructure, sustained shifts in Asian crude sourcing patterns. The honest answer is that no one knows which of these is right. What we can say is that all 3 are now on the table, which is itself the change. Before February 28th, only one was. When Brent crude jumped 6% to $114.44 on May 4th after the attack in the UAE, it wasn't just a reaction to a single morning of violence. It was the sound of the market finally admitting that the old safety nets are gone. We can't 1980s our way out of this crisis. The tankers aren't coming back next week, and the pipelines we were promised would save us can't carry the load. For decades, we treated the Strait of Hormuz as a given. a constant that would always be there. But the 2026 blockade proves that the bypass infrastructure and 1980s precedents we used to calm the markets were actually just security blankets for a global energy system built on a single, unfixable point of failure.